Good evening, and welcome to MPT's Learning from the Past, Leading Our Future. I'm Dr. K. Wise Whitehead, a professor of communication and African American studies at Loyola University, Maryland, and the host of Today with Dr. K on WEAA 88.9 FM. I'm joined tonight by three scholars to spend time talking about Harriet Tubman. Talking about her life and what it meant for her to be a woman of love and a woman of promise, and about her legacy. And we'll get into that, and we invite your questions as we move through the evening. Dr. Kate Clifford Larson is a historian, scholar, and author. She's the author of Bound for the Promised Land, Harriet Tubman, Portrait of an American Hero, and her latest highly praised work, which I absolutely loved, Walk With Me, a biography of Fannie Lou Hamer. She is a leading authority on Harriet Tubman, and she helped to shape Maryland's Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad State and National Park. We're also joined by Dr. Amy Rosencrans, a social studies teacher in Baltimore City Schools and secretary of the Maryland Women's Heritage Center Executive Board. And we're joined by Dr. Ida Jones, who's an archivist at Morgan State University and the author of The Heart of the Race Problem, The Life of Kelly Miller. She's a member of the Maryland Women's Heritage Board of Directors and the vice president for membership for ASALA. I want to start with you, Dr. Kate. And in talking about Harriet Tubman, every time I watch this film, I'm struck by something different. For me, it was thinking about her as a woman who embodied the notion of love. What did it mean for her to love her family so much that she chose to go back? So, can you talk a little bit about what you believe in your research was driving Harriet Tubman?
Dr. K, you're so right. Everything that Tubman did was based in her love for her family and her friends. That's why she pursued freedom. That's why she turned around when she got to Philadelphia after escaping herself and went back to rescue her family members. She said something in later interviews about how when she got to Philadelphia, she was free, but that freedom basically was hollow because everyone she loved was still enslaved in Maryland. So she determined she needed to go back and bring them to freedom as well. So everything that she did before, during the Underground Railroad years, during the Civil War, afterwards when she settled in Auburn, New York, it was all about her love for the family, her friends, the community, and freedom and the pursuit of equality and justice.
Thank you. Dr. Amy, I want to come to you because I want to really delve very quickly into thinking about how we teach about Harriet Tubman in our social studies classroom. I know that as a former teacher, it was difficult for me to help my students separate the myths around Harriet Tubman from the truths about her life. How do you lay out her legacy in your classroom?
So my students are absolutely fascinated with Harriet Tubman, and they love, actually they love learning about these real stories about real people. And we teach about Harriet with the real primary sources, with showing the real sources and explaining to students, oh, there's these lovely picture books that you may have read early on in kindergarten and first grade, but the real story of Harriet is even better than those myths. And they just love being able to be detectives, history detectives, and look at those primary sources and say, oh, that's where she was, or oh, that's what she did. And you teach about it using the real stuff, and they get it. They get it.
Dr. Ida, I want to ask you, what do you think today, as we're now in the midst of Women's History Month and we just came off International Women's Day, what do we have to learn about Harriet Tubman when we think about her as a woman? Because sometimes I think we take away her gender in our discussions of her.
Good question. I guess it goes to the idea of big myth. She becomes almost ghost or phantasm in terms of how she is this kind of superhero. So she was a lived person. She did exist on the planet. She has descendants that are still in the various parts of the eastern shore of Maryland. And I think as an African American woman who was considered property and chattel, who had a rather tortured childhood, that identification with that pain and that status is very essential to our understanding what freedom looks like or what love looks like. So she really humanizes the system of chattel enslavement in a very real way because she lived. And I think that we now pull her down into our lived experience after her bicentennial birthday on last year and really kind of understand her humanity. And that's part of what needs to be expressed in the midst of all of the supernatural things that she did, that she was led by spirit to take certain routes. She was led by spirit to do various things, that the spirit realm in the African tradition is very real as well. So it gives her a greater kind of global sense of purpose in person, whether she's from the Fulla or the Akan or the Wolof, whatever tribal group she's ascended from in Africa, that it gives her greater dimensions of humanity. And then that humanity comes in a gendered form, because she was rather petite. She was rather small, but we see her as magnificently large. But people like Mary McLeod Bethune and Nannie Helen Burroughs, who identified with her as a foremother, saw her as, in their tradition, other African women who have gone before them to throw up paths in the wilderness for others to follow. So that humanity and that gendered humanity is very real for us to understand. And I think, as my co-panelists have mentioned, it's now being pulled into the consciousness of people who don't even remember the 20th century, never mind the 19th century. So we're now facing a whole other generation that can't even relate to the 20th century. And so this is going to be a very interesting way of how they connect with that past.
Thank you. Dr. Keith, I want to come back to you. Before I talk about Harriet Tubman's second husband, I want to spend some time on John Tubman, because that's the name she took, right? She took on her mother's name and Tubman's last name. But my time watching the Harriet Tubman documentary, and I call it a docuseries, kind of the first kind of narrative of her life, finding out that she saved money to buy a suit to take back home to her husband. I would like you to talk about that, because we have to understand, here's someone who's formerly enslaved. So her saving money, penny after penny, to be able to do this was her selling her talent, her time, her treasures to be able to save up enough to take back to a free man who chose not to come with her, with the hopes that she could convince him to come. Can you talk a bit about that story and what that means when we talk about Harriet Tubman as someone who loved?
So clearly, she loved John Tubman. And I have to say, he loved her. He was a free man, and he married an enslaved woman, which meant any children they might have would be enslaved. There were, half the Black population in Dorchester County where they lived was free. He could have married a free woman and had free children, but he had to have loved Harriet and married her in the hopes, I would imagine, that they could have eventually purchased her freedom.
Mm.
But that was thwarted, and she had to run away because her enslaver died and she was going to be sold. He did not go with her. And frankly, if he had and they had been caught, he would have been sold into slavery. So that's a huge ask of a free man, born free of free parents. That's a huge ask. Tubman returning with the suit of clothing is just incredible. She's she's in Philadelphia. She's working for wages and saving her money and dreaming of the day that her husband can join her. And she goes back to the Eastern Shore with this suit of clothing to show him what the possibilities are in Philadelphia and to go with her. And I'm reminded of a documentary that was out a few years ago about the blues artists of the 20th century. And a couple of them in the documentary talked about going from town to town and meeting women. And these women would come to him and bring them suits of clothes as sort of like an enticement. Look what I have for you. And I just thought, wow, 75 years later, this is still happening. Women are in love, and this is what they do. So I just think it's a testament to how strong her love was for John Tubman, and we have to give him a little bit of understanding that he could not go, and that the marriage just didn't survive.
I have a follow-up question for that, Dr. Kate, because in thinking about John Tubman, letting him off the hook, understanding that, it was a very precarious choice, even though when she came back, he was not alone. Let's be very clear.
No.
He had to move forward with his life and whatever understanding that was. But I can't help but think about William and Ellen Craft. And I'm thinking, was there a way that perhaps, now we're using 21st century lenses to look back at their life, right? But thinking about the ways that as a free man with free papers, whether that was something that could have been able to make the road a little bit lighter, because I think that if he had gone with her, I think that she may not have come back so many times. That's what I think might have been the long-term impact.
So that's really interesting. He could have found a way to go with her.
Hmm.
He could have applied for free papers to travel. Um, it's complicated. We don't know the environment
Hmm.
on the day that she left or leading up to it and what happened afterwards to him. We don't know if they went after him, the white authorities. We have no idea. Um, so I mean, the possibility is there, but it's a big ask of a man who was born free and lived his whole life free, and
Hmm.
his whole family was there. Everybody he knew was there, and she was asking him to leave it behind. So it's complicated. Clearly, it's really complicated. And yes, indeed, he found someone else, a free woman whom he married, and they had 4 children together. So,
Might I speculate on that as well,
yeah.
in terms of Solomon Northrop? So
Mhm.
persons who are freeborn were also kidnapped and
Hmm.
enslaved. So had he gone with her and had they been captured, he might have lost all of his freedom
Right.
and possibly his life, because I'm sure he wouldn't go without some kind of fight. So I think there's that real situation being in, quote, the Southland, which is all of North America in comparison to Canada, if one would say, that it was very real for him to be practical in terms of that. One person going can do better than two persons going, because now the visibility is just raised for the one, not the heightened visibility for two persons. The crafts are an amazing story happening almost, what, 20 years before Harriet might be taking her freedom. So in the 1840s or such. So it's very interesting to see about how real that was. And then, of course, we have Mary Cannon or Nant Cannon that's kind of capturing free persons and re-enslaving persons who were. So there was some real serious territories here. And you're thinking no paved roads and other kinds of situations where you had a bounty on your head. So it comes down to capital and physicality. So I think he was to err on the side of caution. If you love them, let them go. And if they come back, they love you more. But he had a lot more to lose in terms of possibly brutality or retribution. In my
Dr.
mind.
Amy, I want to pull you into, because I think that this is actually part of the way that we teach it, right? Because I know that we're all entering into this as historians, but my natural desire as a teacher is to think about the other possibilities here, even though that we don't have all the information. But I think this is how we challenge the students to think beyond what's on the page. What is the real cost of helping someone you love get to freedom?
This is the one of the very most this is one of the parts in the documentary and in the film that you get the gasp from the students. They're like,
Mhm.
"Oh, what? He moved on without her." And it was very interesting, especially with one of my classes when we watched it today. One of my young women was like, "Oh." And when we carried on the conversation about, well, what would you do? How did this happen? She said, well, I don't know what I would have done or what he should have done, but what she did after the rejection was amazing. She goes, that talks to how strong she was. And this young seventh grader, this 12-year-old said, this shows me how strong Harriet Tubman was.
Mhm.
She was able to take that heartbreak, think about it for a minute and move on and then help somebody else. And we don't give our young kids enough credit for how they are able to interpret and understand some of this. And that was one of those moments when I'm like, yeah, they get it.
Dr. Kate, can we then pull in, in terms of talking about Harriet Tubman's strength, before we even get to thinking about her with the Civil War, the fact that it was the second attempt. The first attempt was with her brothers. And that, still not allowing that to deter her to actually move on by herself. Like, that's an incredible show of strength.
Huge. Her brothers became frightened and worried of being captured and what would happen to them. So, as was quoted in her early autobiography, as they dragged her back. But she knew she was going to be sold. So the option was sail to the deep south. She had watched 3 sisters be sold, disappeared, never heard from them again. She was determined that that was not going to happen to her. She felt she had a choice, and she chose to risk her life and run for freedom. And it worked for her. And I credit, Amy, as you identified with your students, they just thought she was amazing and courageous. And she was. She had tremendous courage and also faith in her her ability to make a choice that would benefit herself, and then another choice to come back and bring her family north. So there's something remarkable about that courage. You're right. It's so, I don't know if we don't all have that. So someone like Harriet Tubman inspires us to find that courage in the times that we need it.
Dr. Ida, I want to come to you because I'm thinking now about the fact that the Toni Morrison stamp was just released, and it's an incredible, incredible portrait of Toni Morrison. But Harriet Tubman was the first African American woman to be featured on a stamp, like the 13-cent stamp back in 1978, and then they re-released it in 1995 with a different picture. And so I want to just talk about the ways in which we are still wrestling, or coming to grips with, or trying to understand Harriet Tubman even today.
Yeah, that ties into that mythology. And so as a result, how do we commemorate, quote, a now considered American citizen, which she was actually chattel? How do you wrestle that? To bring her into our contemporary conversation requires us to put her in context of her actual location. And so America is still wrestling with the idea of slavery. So we have kind of polite, nostalgic ideas of, roots in the 1970s or other kinds of kind of tepid ways to address this. But as historians and as scholars and educators, when we actually look at the records that are very graphic in their descriptions, the various elements to control and to torture or to punish, it becomes a far more brutal situation than just simply a matter of you're doing agricultural work. You're not just simply a peasant farmer in terms of, like, say, medieval London. You're actually the physical property that can be maimed, abused, sold, or what have you, dismembered for whatever purpose necessary. I know that the fact when Cicely Tyson played her in the 1970s and being hit in the head with that 2 pound weight, for those who have experienced traumatic brain injury or other kinds of things, and the technology lets us know how sensitive the brain is to anything, there's no movement for the brain. The skull literally holds the brain, so there's no real growth or room for the brain to move. Just to have survived that and to actually be comparable and able to speak, and it's amazing. So clearly, those of us people of faith believe that the hand of God was on her life. So she now becomes this prism through which you see your America refracted, whether it's a gendered reality, a Southern-born reality, an African reality, an African American reality, a person of faith reality, a freedom seeker. She then now can become ubiquitous, and we all, as American citizens, born or naturalized, can relate to her. But it's going to be with some contest because it's not going to be equal relations. So as a result, that's part of it. We like things to be neat and packaged and beautiful and lovely. And that's not her life nor her legacy, but it's one in which you can see yourself reflected in that prism of light.
Dr. Kate, I think it's fascinating because thinking about the fact that Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass were existing at the same time. Like, one, Frederick Douglass is the most photographed man of the 19th century, and one, Harriet Tubman, who's working on the fringes, and both of them are larger than life today. We talk a lot about Harriet Tubman as Moses, right? And what that experience. I want to push it a little bit farther because we're getting questions in the chat about, what should we know about Harriet Tubman that maybe the film doesn't capture? Can you talk a little bit about Harriet Tubman spy, Harriet Tubman Combahee Ferry raid, Harriet Tubman leading Union soldiers through South Carolina, my hometown, right? And what was happening there? Can you talk a little bit about her at that part of her life?
Right. So people forget this. She was driven during the 1850s to rescue her family and friends on the Underground Railroad, but she, at the core, was this Harriet Tubman, this fierce warrior for the fight for freedom. And so when the Civil War started, she immediately finds her way via the governor of Massachusetts, who makes it possible for her to go to South Carolina. And her reputation preceded her, and these Union generals were amazed by her courage, her brilliance. She was a genius. She could not read or write text, but she certainly was a genius and had incredible literacies. And they recognized that, and she became a spy and a scout during the Civil War. That's remarkable. This 5 foot tall, disabled, formerly enslaved woman in the Civil War, where it's all these men, and they're looking to her as this incredible leader and spy and scout. And uh, I think we should not underestimate the power of that woman and her personality and her presence in front of people. They followed her because they recognized her as a leader very quickly. I mean, that's not easy to do. And she did it. There was something about her. And we need to really celebrate that and respect it and honor it. Because I think that there's so much there that we're still not understanding about her, but her legacy lives on, and people never forgot her. I mean, throughout the 20th century, she was still remembered, particularly in the African American community, but she was never forgotten, where so many other African American historical characters and others and women, etc., were forgotten. She was not forgotten.
Then, Dr. Amy, with that in mind, she was not forgotten. I think it's interesting because I feel like she comes in and out of history. Like if you kind of track kind of the trajectory, there are points in history when Harriet Tubman's life was heavily researched and talked about, and then it kind of falls off, and then it comes back. We're at that moment now because we are thinking about projects like Janelle Hobson's project with Ms. Magazine, or the work that we're watching with the film by Maryland Public Television. Now there's a resurgence of research and discussion about Harriet Tubman that directly connects to this conversation around the $20 bill, which I do want to get to in just a moment. So, Dr. Amy, how do we teach about Harriet Tubman, the Civil War, Harriet Tubman, who then married a former Union soldier, her second husband? Like that's another part of her life.
Well, I think that's the part that I know that when I was growing up, and Kay, I think we're around the same age, we never learned about the Civil War stuff. We never learned about the spy stuff. We learned that she maybe made 300 trips down south and all that big mythology, right? But now when we're learning the real history, I mean, the first gasp I get when I teach about Harriet is her husband has moved on. The second gasp is when we talk about the raid, and they're like, oh, wow. And I'm going to say, pardon my French, one of my students will always say, oh my gosh, Harriet was a badass. And they wanted me to say that tonight live because they just wanted me to make sure I said that. But it's true. I mean, she was. And the things that she did, and she's coming back. And tomorrow we are talking about this idea of, should Harriet Tubman be on the $20 bill? This is one of the things that brings history to life for students, getting the opportunity to learn the real history and then discussing how it's impacting us today. Who's on the $20 bill now? And what's the story around whether Harriet should be on it? We should change it to be Harriet. And this is how we engage kids. This is how we get kids talking and understanding real life and what's going on.
Then, Dr. Ida, I come to you. In thinking about the fact that Harriet Tubman, I mean, I kind of see it maybe in 4 stages, and I want to hear what you think. So, one is this childhood, Minty, the stories of her and her father, and how she would learn about the moss, and I got that part, right? Then the story of Harriet Tubman as Moses and driven by love. I've always heard the John Tubman story and always heard, I mean, I've heard variations of she walked in and there was another woman. That I've heard all kinds of stories about that growing up. Harriet Tubman, Civil War and spy. And I heard it early because of Combahee and understanding the work that Black women did when they did it in a writing group with the Combahee group. But I'm thinking about the 4th stage when she's in Auburn and she has created a community of family and friends, and she helped them get to freedom. And then they're all living around her in this very safe and perhaps free environment. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of family? That's a theme that runs all the way through her life.
Well, it's almost a full circle, because if it's birthed in love and birthed in this sense of gender equity with her father, investing in her as a female child, it continues throughout her entire life. Amanda Berry Stewart does the same kind of thing. So women are, quote, nesters, right? So they're always creating these nests and communities for people to be. But I think having seen the enslavement system and knowing that once you're past the age of relevance, you're kind of just put out to pasture to kind of fend for yourself or to simply grow back into the dirt, that was not going to happen, because I believe there was a strong sense of spirituality that she had. I know that she was affiliated with the Methodist Church. And so the idea that you're simply a link in a chain, that you came from eternity, you're now in time, and you're going to go back to eternity, that is important upon you or incumbent upon you to leave the place better than you found it. So as a result, creating this sense of community allows for those kinds of narratives to go through in a way that is lived. I don't have to write a book or tell you a poem. I can live my life in this fashion that you can see by my actions what my love language is. So I think she was very clear on that, that she could not be full with herself if she did not give of herself. And the more she gave, the greater she was able to be full. And it's kind of a very oxymoronic way in terms of how acquiring things in the kind of corporal way we think about things. The more you have physically, the better you are. But her thing was to kind of disperse and diffuse these things so that the better we is. And, that's kind of bad English, but it goes back to Ubuntu. So I think that was very clear in the enslaved community. And that's why people would call each other sister and brother, because literally you didn't know if you were related sanguinely or you were simply fictive kin in terms of this new plantation situation. So the idea of kinship and love and the survivability of the race was very essential. She even opens an old folks home, and she's concerned about young people as well. So both ends of the life spectrum, the children and the seniors. And then we're in the middle because we leave one phase to go to another phase. So we're just kind of passing the baton. So I think that community that she created in Auburn was one of those spaces where she could actually own property. Believe her parents actually came to live with her. Correct me if I'm wrong. Scholars on Harriet Tubman. And so you're breathing free air, at least for that 1 month, 5 month, 3 years, that you could actually have your full sense recognized and realized.
So Dr. Kate, so with that in mind, I want to go back and with this fourth stage here. So she was married to John Tubman, 1844 to 1851, kind of, married in terms of how, enslaved people were able to marry, even though we know there was a really fine line between whether it was actual legal marriage or not. But he was killed in 1867, I believe, in an altercation with a white man who was never convicted. 1869, after, the Civil War, Harriet Tubman marries Nelson Davis, a formerly enslaved man who was also a Union soldier. They were married until 1888. Now, there's some people, like I was taught at one time, that she married him because she didn't receive military benefits, but as the wife of someone who was who's a Union soldier, she was able to get military benefits. Then I heard maybe she married him because he was young and she loved him. Like, can you talk a little bit about Harriet Tubman's second husband?
Well, he was 22 years younger than she was. And, uh, she didn't have to marry him. And I'm saying they fell in love and got married. I mean, and he's 22 years younger. He's he's going to marry a woman that's 22 years older than he is. I just imagine that he arrives at her house in Auburn looking for a room to stay because she did take in boarders. He's there to start working in the mills in Auburn, New York. Some of his war buddies are there already working. And, he's with Harriet Tubman. How could he not fall in love with her?
Harriet Tubman. It's Harriet. And she was
Seriously.
well known. I think people have to understand that Harriet Tubman was very well known. I try to, when I work with young people, Dr. Amy, I have to have them think they didn't have text, they didn't have tweets, they didn't have Facebook, but Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass were very well known, larger than life in so many ways.
Yes.
So can you talk about how the word of Harriet Tubman was spread when they weren't, for young people? It's like, well, if they weren't using Facebook and if they weren't tweeting, how did they know what was happening around the country, and why she was a messenger as well?
That's
Yeah,
right.
we talk about the importance of African American newspapers and getting the word out amongst the African American community. We talk about the oral histories and the stories that are passed down, and that it's a hard one. I mean, kids don't get, there's no telephones maybe no telephones, but the internet, heaven forbid we not have Snapchat or Instagram or TikTok. So that's a hard one with kids. But when we started looking, we looked at African American newspapers this week. They're like, oh, now we're starting to get it a little bit. But then we talk about this literacy thing. Not everyone was able to read the African American newspapers, and we talk about the legacy of literacy and the different types of literacies that there are.
Right.
Dr. Ida, I want to come to you. Because Harriet Tubman lived until what, 91 years of age. And there's this idea when you think about what that meant as a woman born enslaved. You freed yourself, right? You stole yourself away, but then you had a very rich and full life on the other side as well, to go until the age of 91. Can you talk a little bit about, for young people who are trying to really understand the importance of the longevity that comes along with, even these very daring choices that she made? She was blessed to have this very long life, to see family members grow up, to be able to interact with her two nieces that she called her sisters in a sense.
Yeah, that's a very remarkable age, even in contemporary times. Never mind at that particular time. The lifespan was not very long for those who did that kind of work. But I think the fact that her life and having met a Mary McLeod Bethune, or breathed the same air as Mary McLeod Bethune, dying in what, 1913. So you're touching a whole other generation of persons who are going to live throughout the greater part of the 20th century. Was magnificently huge. I mean, Douglass dies in 1895. He's also able to kind of touch that, but she crosses over into the 20th century. So you think her parents would have been born possibly during the 18th century. She lives the 19th. So you're bringing almost 2 centuries of the lived experience into the 20th century. And then to have been so settled and calm in her own spirit about various things was very instructive. I think there's been a series of writings about people who actually encountered her and met her and found her to be kind of a sage, or kind of a almost here we go back to mythic, almost divinity in a sense, to be able to have that kind of transfer of that calm and that vision. So I think for people who think that 50 is old, to someone who's 12 or 15, anyone who's over 35 is ancient, time to them. And of course, even with their cell phones, by the time they're 15, they might have had 3 cell phones. So the idea of longevity for them is not very long, it's microwave. So if you talk oven cooking or open fire cooking, to them it's like, Neanderthal. So I think the idea of understanding time is very important, because she lived through various stages of where women were categorized a certain way, where African Americans were categorized a certain way, even photography. She's born before Daguerre. So the idea of photography, and then what it costs to have photos made. So she's living through all this technological change, all this economic flux, all these kinds of changes to one's designation societally. And she's outliving Anthony and Caddy Stanton in terms of some things in that first generation of suffrage. So she's living this life and seeing these changes and weathering it with the same kind of discipline. I think it's a very good example for some of our young people as they kind of go through middle school into high school, and should they choose to go to vocational or collegiate education, we're always changing, we're always growing. She never stopped giving, and she never stopped learning, which are very essential parts to kind of not just stay with her cohort. She engaged younger and older people, as well as she morphed from being young to being old. She did not just stay with her cohort. So it's very instructive for us to kind of look at her. Once again, I can't help but think of a prism and how the light of that is refracted in various ways and how we can identify with her. I unfortunately have to take leave of the group,
Oh,
so I have
thank you
to go
so
somewhere else. But I want to thank you for this conversation
thank you
and
so much.
encourage the audience to read the books by Dr. Larson, and definitely visit the Maryland Women's Heritage Center as well as the Maryland Women's Hall of Fame, because there's some amazing women out of Maryland who are contemporaries of Tubman as well as others. So, and thank you, Dr. K, for what you do as well in media. So
Thank you
thank
so
you
much,
so
Dr.
much.
Ida Jones,
Happy.
archivist of Morgan State University and author of The Heart of the Race Problem, The Life of Kelly Miller. I want to come back to you, Dr. K. I get so excited about this because when I try to help students understand, and sometimes I have to make sure I understand, because when you talk about Harriet Tubman and you talk about slavery, there's this feeling it was a long time ago. And the way I ground myself is I have to remember that Harriet Tubman died the same year Rosa Parks was born. Like, if you look at it like that, you realize this is not hundreds of years ago, because students can relate to Rosa Parks like now. And to think that, wow, that happened in 1930, the very same year, gives you a sense of how long Harriet Tubman lived and how she was a part of the contemporary shaping of American history.
Right. And also to think about the communities that maintained her history and her memory. because that plays a big role in how we have come to know her and remember her today. And while some of the stories and her histories were kind of altered over time to suit the needs of different generations, the fact that like the city of Auburn, the residents of Auburn, her relatives maintain that memory all 100 and some odd years. The AME Zion Church in Auburn and the church as a whole has maintained her memory and celebrated her legacy all this time. So there was this power about her and her story, and she touched so many lives in the 19th century and into the 20th century that really she couldn't be shaken off. She couldn't be disregarded like so many other historical characters. We really need to reflect on the power of that personality and that drive of hers that touched so many people, even those people who didn't necessarily really care to get to know this little petite Black woman who was formerly enslaved. The power of her demands on people. And we talked today about how she did so much for her family and the community, and fighting in the war, and pursuing freedom and equality her whole life. But it wasn't only her. She demanded the people around her do the same thing, that they do the right thing. The white abolitionists, the suffrage women that she was involved in, when the suffrage movement split over the issue of giving suffrage to Black women, she reminded those white suffragists how important it was for everyone to have the vote. And so she was not just out there plowing forward herself. She brought people along. She demanded that they do the right thing and use their power and influence to make a difference.
So I want to ask you as we begin to wrap up, just kind of a two-part question. I'll start with you, Dr. Amy, because one of our listeners wanted to know, has it been a consideration to a Harriet Tubman holiday? Like, what is happening with that? And then your thoughts on Harriet Tubman on the 20. I think these are just fascinating questions because it did, she didn't just, she was not chosen. There was a poll taken and people were asked who should be on the 20. Now, some of us, when we voted, thought they were just talking about just one person. No one just understood that she'd be on the back and the same white guy that's there would be on the front. But just putting that aside, she was selected by people to be the woman on the 20. So can you talk a little bit about where you stand with Harriet Tubman on money? And then, of course, the potential of a holiday for Harriet Tubman.
Well, I think the idea that the majority of Americans chose her to be the woman shows us how long lasting her legacy is in American history. Now, we might not all know the real story. We might all still have that mythology in mind, but the fact that she has survived and she is in people's minds is amazing. And we're celebrating Harriet Tubman Day tomorrow at my elementary middle school. But, a holiday for Harriet, I don't think it's a bad idea. My students would be all into it. Um, I think the idea is that we're learning about the reality, the real story of Harriet Tubman, and just having these discussions with adults, but especially with children, with students who need to start to be able to have civil conversations about topics is one of the more important things that we can do.
And so then I come to you, Dr. Kate. I know this is probably a question I know that you have answered, if not dozens, maybe hundreds of times about Harriet Tubman on the 20. Number one, it's the most circulated bill that we have in this country. I mean, so it's, and then I've gone back and forth. I will say the one time you and I were on a panel, maybe during COVID, I remember we were on Zoom, and I was like, absolutely not. I don't want Harriet Tubman being passed around with, greasy palms, and she was sold for money. Now she's on the money. And now I'm starting to think, there's something about longevity. It's something about the story, even though in the back of your mind you forget who's on the money. When someone says run me the Washingtons, I know what they're talking about, right? So where do you stand on it now that we've had this kind of long running discussion, perhaps debate about it?
So I think it's a brilliant idea. It's really important. Our currency supposedly, the figures on our currency represent supposedly the best of America and its patriots and its pursuit of freedom and equality. Well, no one represents that better at this moment in time than Harriet Tubman. And as you said, um, it is the most popular currency in this country, but it's actually the most popular currency around the world, American currency. So to have $20 bills with Harriet Tubman there representing an American patriotism, freedom, equality, justice, self determination, family, community. I can't imagine anybody more perfect on our currency than Harriet Tubman.
Mm.
And it's going to happen. And I think it's going to be an amazing, amazing thing. It shows the growth of this country and moving towards the celebration of true American heroes.
Now it makes me laugh, Dr. Amy, because I'm thinking about Harriet Tubman on the 20 at a time we're barely using money anymore, right? I mean, I know that. I'm trying to think of the last time I had a $20 bill in my hand, right? So I'm excited about the possibilities, but also understanding that that's just another way of how quickly the country moves and shifts. For my last question for you, Dr. Amy Rosencrantz, and I'm going to end with you, Dr. Kate, social studies teacher in Baltimore City Schools and secretary of the Maryland Women's Heritage Center Executive Board. I would like to ask you a question that came from our audience. What is something about Harriet Tubman that's not in the film that you think people need to know?
Wow. I think that's an excellent question. I think one of the things is this idea, and it was barely touched on in the film, is her work with suffrage and her work for women's rights and her interactions with the greater white community. And as Dr. Kate has touched on, yes, she was a part of the suffrage movement, but she called the white members of the suffrage movement to task. And I think that is something that we need to elaborate more on, because as we talk about, and we're past the 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment, but we need to continue to confront those issues that were a part of the suffrage movement. And Harriet Tubman helps us confront those issues.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kate. I come to you. Best-selling author of critically acclaimed biographies, including Bound for the Promised Land, Harriet Tubman, Portrait of an American Hero, Rosemary, the Hidden Kennedy Daughter, The Assassin's Accomplice, and her highly praised latest work, Walk With Me, a biography of Fannie Lou Hamer. She's a leading authority on Harriet Tubman. She helped to shape Maryland's Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad State and National Park. So, Dr. Kate, you know so much about Harriet Tubman. She is alive to you in ways that maybe she's not to other people. You've been living with Harriet Tubman and her work. What is something that's not in the film that you look at and say, people need to know this about?
There's so much that isn't in the film. Of course, I'm a historian, so it could have been a 20-part series for me on PBS. Um, I think that it would have been nice to acknowledge the people that she loved, that she helped rescue, and also the other people that she was involved in the struggle with, and also talking about her relationship with Frederick Douglass, her relationship with John Brown, the radical abolitionist. They were very close, um, and and the I think her life in Auburn really wasn't touched on. The director of the Harriet Tubman Home in Auburn, New York, talks so eloquently about Tubman and her farm, and how that farm was her piece of Maryland that she could never have. And that farm provided food for her family, and her home provided shelter for her family and friends and people who were homeless. So that farm, needs a lot more attention today from us, because it represents the Tubman in freedom and what she did with that soil and that property to bring life and sustenance to many, many people.
Thank you so much. I'm Dr. Kay Watts Whitehead, the professor of communication and African American studies at Loyola University, Maryland, the host of Today with Dr. K on WEAA. And one of the things I would love to hear more about is I want to hear more about her and Nelson Davis. People know the name John Tubman. I mean, that's just a common name. When you think about Harriet Tubman's husband, you think about John Tubman. But this relationship with Nelson Davis, that's after she was Moses, after her work in the Civil War, after slavery ended, when she was a place in a community that she really helped to create, when she was settled, when she wasn't on the run for her life, when she didn't have the burden of freedom for her people so constant on her shoulders, what that must have been like for her to have this young man who saw her probably as larger than life and maybe really have moments of just happiness and joy that we don't usually associate with Harriet Tubman. It's always about fatigue, fear, this incredible heroism and courage, but that there's joy and there's laughter and there's love. And I'd love to have a more complete story on that. Thank you so much, folks. This has been Maryland Public Television's Learning from the Past, Leading Our Future, our Harriet Tubman webinar. Thank you so much for your questions and for your time.